Hey, thanks everybody for being here. Before we do anything else, can we say a big welcome back to Chuck Sam?
Nichalawan and I'm Yuma. Good evening, my friends and relatives. It's so wonderful to be back home with my wife, Lori, and my youngest, Ruby. We are so pleased to be back among the community members and out of the Washington, D.C. area.
So thank you, Chuck, for coming back from D.C. Thank you also for going to D.C. That's a big trip.
Thank you all.
My name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities. I want to tell you a little bit about what's up this evening. This event is part of a program called Consider This, and the series this year is on a theme, the people and the public. And we haven't yet talked about land and people's relationship to land. And so tonight, I don't think there's anybody in the universe that would be better to talk about public land and our relationship to it than Chuck Sams, and to do it here in the Pendleton Center for the Arts. Thank you, Roberta Lavador. Thank you to the center for hosting us. I want to say a couple other thanks. Going to ask you a couple questions to help Chuck get a sense of the room. Then we're going to start talking for a bit, and then we're going to invite questions from this microphone. And then at the end, we will hear just a little bit. We'll invite Bobby Connor up from Tomastilik to help us close the evening. So that's the shape of the evening. I also, in addition to saying welcome to all of you, I want to say welcome to a group in Salem at Willamette University that's joining as a group online, watching right now, and there are people all over the state and probably over the country checking this out. And so I just want to say welcome and remind everyone here that there's a lot of people joining you from different places. I want to say a couple quick thanks. Pacific West Bank, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Standard, the Susan Hammer Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, and I want to say a sort of complicated thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's a genuine thanks, but it's a complicated moment, and there are parallels to the National Park Service that may come up later. But I really do want to say a big thanks to all of those organizations, and I want to say thanks to many people here who show up at community events and talk to each other and support community programming in so many ways, and that is so important. And so just want to say thanks here at the start of this one. Thank you for being here. Thanks for doing all of that. I want to ask you a couple of questions to help Chuck get a sense of the room. If this is your first Oregon Humanities event, could you make a little noise? Okay. And if you've been to an Oregon Humanities event before, could you make a little noise? Okay. Welcome to both groups. Glad you're all here. Next question is, if there's a place on public land that has some real significance for you, could you make a little noise? Last question, and maybe a little more complicated, but if you are 100% sure that you could explain to a curious 10-year-old how a piece of land becomes public land, please make some noise. Okay, we're all gonna talk to this gentleman. Okay, so Chuck, that's the room. We're gonna talk a bit about public lands. I want to start by asking you the second question that I asked the group here, and that is there a place that when you were younger, maybe on public land especially, a place that has some significance for you? Why and where is it, to the extent that you want to talk about where it is?
It's easy. It's a Cocopah Creek. Growing up here on the Umatilla Indian Reservation and spending time with my late grandfather, Charles F. Sam Sr., we spent many, many hours on a Cocopah Creek during different times of the year so that I could understand not only the seasons, but history. I still carry around the rock that he gave me, a stone that we found in the creek, and about age 5 or 6, and he would ask me questions from time to time about that rock. Who was here? Who stepped on it? How was it formed? What swims over it? What would attach itself to it? It wasn't until I got to high school that I was realizing that I was getting a traditional education of trying to understand my place in the world with flora and fauna, and my connection to the land, and how do I be a good steward of those resources.
that word steward you just said, I think we're going to probably come back to, but I want to ask you in a way the opposite of what you just said and ask, do you remember a place when you were younger that you didn't have access to, that you wanted to, or that felt off limits in some way?
The only place, and it was 1979, and the reservation, for those who were here, knew that the reservation was pretty desolate. We were living in the projects, and a group of boys wanted to go play football. And the grass on the projects wasn't really nice. There was a lot of broken glass and other things. But the lawn in front of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building was beautifully manicured. And so we all ran down there from the playground to go play football, and the superintendent came out and yelled at us to get off of this government land. Mm-hmm. This is government property. And I stood and turned and said, I am government property. He laughed and said, well, then all you boys can just play football.
Okay. So you gave him the right answer.
Yes.
It's interesting to think about government land. And now I want to ask that you're freshly back from the National Park Service, still doing natural resources work, but especially with the National Park Service in mind, maybe to start, sort of, what's it feel like to come back here after being in D.C., overseeing an institution responsible for so many parks and 22,000 employees? How does it feel, just as a way of grounding, to come back?
You know, there was... Lori and I had some adjustment, and so did Ruby, but I think it's home. And so you finally feel that you're at home. I've done several tours now on the East Coast. In 1989, when I finished intelligence school in Virginia Beach, I got on the plane, back in the days when you still had to walk up to the plane, and turned around and yelled, I am never coming back here again. It was humid. I don't understand humidity. It was hot. It was uncomfortable. And I swore I never would come back. The gentleman in front of me ended up being my seatmate, and he was a Southerner from Norfolk. And he said, son, you're going to live to regret those words. And he has.
He was right.
This is my fourth, and I don't know if it's my final tour. It's my fourth tour in the East Coast and my third tour in the Washington, D.C. area. Okay.
And do you feel like, I feel like park is a funny word, and to have a National Park Service, park sounds like play. Does park feel playful to you now at the end of this service you just gave to the National Park Service?
No. I mean, our parks all across the United States, all 430 plus units, are managed specifically and in different ways, from a historical perspective, for protection of flora and fauna, from a cultural resources. So, you know, and that just reflects the diversity of who we are as Americans and the lands we set aside from ourselves. But no, I'm reminded, you know, I was there to celebrate the 150th birthday of America's first national park, Yellowstone. And I'm made very, very aware that that land was taken away from several tribes. 59 tribes that had usual custom rights to it. 6 tribes that actually still own the land and had not been given up by treaty yet.
So even thinking about the first park, Yellowstone, little over 150 years ago, was both taken away and in some way protected. Is that accurate to say that some of both was? Maybe what I'm asking is, what's a park for?
You know, the Organic Act of 1916 finally defines what parks are for. We settle outside these lands in posterity for ourselves and future generations, for our enjoyment and for learning and cultural resource and natural resource protection. And that's true. That's what we do now for parks, starting in 1916. But parks that were created prior to that, yes, they were set aside mostly for their environmental splendor. But there was this false idea that these places were untouched by human beings when people have lived here for thousands of years. I'm reminded of my grandfather again. When I was a kid in the 1970s, I came home and was so excited to tell him, I've learned we've been here for 10,000 years. And he said 30. I was like, what? No, the teacher told me we've been here 10,000 years. When I finished high school, they said we've been here between 12 and 15,000 years. I came back and told them in the 80s, hey, Grandpa, they danced like 12 to 15,000 years. 30. By the time I finished college, They said Native people have been here probably 18 to 20,000 years. He passed. And then, most recently, at the turn of this last century, they said they've been here for at least 20 to 22,000 years. And then we discovered footprints at White Sands. And the latest data showed between 24 to 26,000. But while I was director, we found another set 20 feet below that. And the carbon dating came back to 30,000 years. So nobody ever just stopped to ask us, how long you been here? 30,000 years. Those people, though, manipulated like all humans do the landscape. And they had successes and failures. We know that. We can see that. They lived through at least 4 major climate change events in those 30,000 years, including an ice age. But they manipulated the landscape to fit their needs so that not only could they survive, but they could thrive. And when Yellowstone was, quote unquote, discovered, there were a group of Crow who were managing the meadow that year. They were doing a burn, and those original journals talk about this burn, and they don't understand why the Indians are burning the grass. Well, they were burning it for regeneration of traditional medicines and plants, and to ensure the grasses came back more stronger for the herds of both bison and elk.
I mean, as you talk about that sweep of time, 30,000 years, and then we think about when the first National Park was created, when the Organic Act happened, when the National Park Service became something that we recognize as what it is today. It seems like a new innovation, almost a kind of technology, a park. It's a tool for something. What's your sense of what it's for? What's the need that a park fulfills?
There's a lot of needs. One, it captures a moment in time of flora and fauna and allows us to take a longer stance in studying that flora and fauna, cataloging it, getting a better understanding of the relationship that we have with the land, the water, the air. It also allows us to tell the story of at that time period, of what those natural resources were, how are they being used by humans. In some places, it actually captures and holds our collective history and culture, whether that is the Hopewell Mountains that talk about a millennia of culture, or you're at Gettysburg and tells the very deep and sad story of Americans fighting Americans, and you can actually feel the hallowed ground and the sadness in that place.
It's interesting to think about the human stories. I mean, even in the story, the first thing you talked about, the creek where you went with your grandfather, it felt to me like you were talking both about human relationships and relationships to the land, to the stones that were there. I guess I want to ask more about that, because it seems like this funny thing was created, this thing that's called a park that includes this idea of use without impairment, which is a funny phrase, and it seems like a core phrase, use without impairment. So the sense that somehow use might be damaging. How do you understand use without impairment, which seems to be core to understanding a national park?
First and foremost, I want to say that I had the huge honor and pleasure of leading over 20,000 dedicated federal servants who loved their job. Many of them would tell, and they used to tell me, what you pay me, Director, you pay me in sunrises and sunsets. But I'd really like to make a fair wage earning. And so spent a lot of time up in Congress asking for more money for staff. But their job, they do not see any contradiction. And a lot of people do between use of the park and the preservation of the park. Because if you're a good steward of that park, you are continually ensuring that the flora and fauna are protected, that those cultural resources are protected, and ensuring that the American public have access to that so that they can learn about what it means to be a good steward.
I hear you saying that, and I'm remembering my recent experience at Zion. Shuttle buses. It felt like not a national park, but an amusement park. And so I want to ask you about, when we're thinking about public lands, and maybe especially the form of public lands that is called a park, the relationship between use or access on one hand, which feels thoroughly democratic and participatory, and preservation on the other.
No, and those can be difficult in figuring out how to manage. We went around and around. The National Park Service is, and rightfully so, a very decentralized organization for the most part. Superintendents, he or she, are the captains of their ship. They are given a lot of latitude in how to implement policy. And first and foremost, though, they must look at the particular act that set them up as a park, and that they have to manage to that park for those purposes. And that's not always easy. And access was one of those. Zion is that. So I was there when we celebrated and put in the new electrified buses, and was very excited to do that.
Yeah.
Because my experience, the last time I'd been in Zion Park was 1993, when every car could come in, and it felt overrun then.
Yeah.
We were supposed to spend 3 days there. I spent a day there, and I was so angry with the parking that we left at the end of the day and made our way down to Arizona instead. And to come back in and see now that we're using electric buses, people can be picked up and dropped off. The traffic wasn't there, but there were a lot of people on trails. And whether that's, Angels Landing or anywhere else, there is that issue. But at the same time, we were trying to ensure that we're not restricting, because it does belong to the American people, but we were trying to focus then, how do we teach about being better stewards? How do you protect that resource? How do you ensure people aren't just wandering off trail? Are people understanding the different types of plants that are there, and what do they do and serve, and what is their ecosystem function to the rest of the landscape? Now, most people don't go more than a couple hundred yards from their car, but I liked the buses, and because it actually forced people, we're now seeing them going at least a quarter mile, if not further, into the park, because now, you can that, or you can just stand around and wait for a bus. Instead, people are actually now getting out and doing so. And so we were putting more folks in the field to do interpretation, and to meet people, having more backcountry rangers as there used to be, and doing more interpretation about what it is to be a good steward.
Early in that response, you said, because that land belongs to the American people. And I want to ask what that means to you, both that sentence on its face and against what you said about the people that were there living on the land before the parks were created.
So, it just depends. And right, so for some folks in tribes, land was literally taken. For the Confederated Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation, it wasn't that we weren't pushed into it and that we hadn't been at war against the United States on it, but what we have is a treaty of peace. We don't have a treaty of war. We have a treaty of peace, and in that, it recognized that, we would do mutual defense with the United States. At the end of Article 2 of the Treaty of 1855, the President of the United States will arm said Indians from time to time for their own defense against other Indians and other potential invaders. And so that's why I think also those provisions exist in a number of treaties, and there are over 370. And it's also why you see the largest group of citizens, American Indians, by ethnicity, joining the military, because we feel we have an obligation to serve and to protect these lands because they are ours. They're being occupied by the United States, and they're being managed by the United States, but we have a responsibility to co-manage those and co-stewardship those lands hand in hand. And so when I say the American people, you include tribes, because in 1924, whether we wanted to or not, we were made American citizens.
So it's interesting to think that you just ran the National Park Service, the United States of America's National Park Service, not, for example, a tribal park service. And I wonder, did it feel like you were, in a way, working for an organization I'm asking about how vexed that felt for you, if it felt vexed at all.
No, there's always a mixed feeling. But again, because I come from a group of people who did a treaty of peace, and we've fought to preserve our rights to go to all usual custom stations, to be able to hunt, fish, and gather, to be co-managers, that we've won a number of court cases, from the Winans decision in 1905 to the Bolt to the Bologna decision, that we have secured that right under treaty to co-manage salmon, to co-manage water, to co-manage landscapes and lands held in common with citizens in the United States. It didn't feel that strange to me to be the director of the National Park Service. It just felt an extension of what I'm already responsible to do within the 6 million acres that we ceded to the United States, and then the millions of acres beyond that, because we went to Buffalo, all the way into Buffalo country, and which is present-day Montana and Wyoming. And when you're there, you're still also helping those other tribes to ensure and protect and preserve those lands and steward them in a way so that those species will keep coming back and the plants will keep coming back. It just felt an extension of a responsibility that I'd already been charged with.
So responsibility, and you used the word steward several times already, and that pushes, I guess, me in the direction of a question about the relationship between public land and private land. And I want to ask it like as naively as I can. I think that's naive is a polite way for me to say ignorant. Like, what can you do on public land that can't be done on private land? And in a way, the same thing in reverse.
Well, first of all, I want to get rid of the notion that Native people didn't understand private ownership of land. Some of the very first land leases I have ever got to see was when I was with the Trust for Public Land and was working with the Wampanoag and Narragansett people in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And they showed me some of the very early land leases, which also made me laugh because they're on these pieces of parchment by Englishmen who, when they landed on the shores, they wanted to lease land. The men met them on the shores, went into their villages, and went to their women who actually owned the land. And the women agreed to parcels of land to be set aside for these colonies, and they made their mark. Well, when they brought the paperwork back down to the beach, they tell me the English were mad because they didn't see the mark being made, and they wanted to know which of the men made the mark, and they tried to explain it was their women that made the mark because we don't own the land. The women own the land. It's a matrilineal society. And you can see the mark crossed out, and they made the men re-sign. So you have misogyny right away, coupled with what I would consider an illegal lease. But that's beside the point. Because even under European international law on land rights, that was an illegal act. But that being said, the ideals between private ownership and public ownership, there are different. The bundle of rights, which actually come from more of a European concept than a native concept, is still a bundle of rights. Private ownership of land, when you acquire that land, means that you can grant certain rights for other people how to use those or not. And then public ownership is for everybody. Now, even tribes understood and fought for territory, but they had a general right that is very, very foreign to European understanding of land rights, that a usufruct right, which meant that people could travel through our territory. You have a right as a human being to take water, to eat the food off of it, to even camp, use wood, as long as you're moving through the territory. This is why I always point out in the Oregon Trail, how many people came across the Oregon Trail? Anybody know?
Depending on which years you count.
Right, about 300,000. About 10% of them died. 30,000 people. Now, growing up in the 1970s and 80s and watching Sunday Afternoon Cowboys and Indians movie, I grew up thinking my people must have killed a lot of those people. The Army keeps really good records. And their best records show on the Oregon Trail that about 400, less than 500 settlers were killed by Indians. So if you have 30,000 people die, 29,500 of them died from dysentery, snake bites, oxen rolling over on them. But there's been this perpetual thing that said that it must have been Indians who were killing these people. But it's not. Why? Because they believed in that right, that as long as they're traveling through my territory and you don't stop, I must provide for them. And our own people did that same thing. That's why you have Immigrant Springs. It was a spring, we said, sure, you can get water here. You take as much water as you need, but keep on moving.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about, I guess again about, while you were talking, I was thinking again about this innovation of developing parks, which I think was this country. Am I right about that? That we didn't, that in a way Europe came over and
My friends in Australia want to argue that their park in New South Wales, which was established 2 years after ours, was the first park because it was colonially established 10 years before Yellowstone, but it wasn't accepted by the Crown until 2 years after Yellowstone. So it didn't become a national park until 2 years after we declared Yellowstone a national park. So that being said, though, we are the leaders in having some of the most national parks and the largest national parks.
And like what was going on here in, say, the 1870s that some people thought, we got to change the way we think about this land. We got to change the way we demarcate the public's access to it. And then that just seemed to grow as we get into the 1920s, 1930s, and now 22,000 people, or maybe not anymore, but a lot of people. Why? What was happening in the 1870s here, and then the increase of that?
1870s, 1880s, somebody calls the Golden Era, not naming any names. and wants to relive that golden era was the time of the land barons. And it was time of the robber barons, and it was time of industry really starting to pick up in this country, and they were taking up a good portion of the land for railroads and for construction and for harvesting of timber. And there were conservationists who said, no, we need to figure out how to protect those lands. But conservation in this country has gone through fits and starts. I mean, I look back to early ideals of conservation, and there was this idea that we should set aside lands and let the natives live on it and live the romantic lifestyle that they thought we lived on, bareback on horses and set aside. But by the 1870s and 1880s, it was thought that you needed to remove all people on the land, that this was garden, the last elements of the Garden of Eden here in North America, and that we should remove the human people off of it and preserve these lands set aside for ourselves. It really doesn't become truly ideals of public land until after the end of World War I and the Organic Act of 1919.
And do you have a sense of why then?
Or 1916, sorry.
So I'm not going to catch you on dates. I don't know them, and I couldn't catch you anyway.
My staff who are watching, former staff, I'll get a text.
Give him a pass. He's asking. I mean, why that? Why? So it's interesting to think in the 1870s, you see a relationship between the protection of some land and the sense that it's all getting bought up and used in maybe more aggressive ways. Why does that continue through, say, the 20s and 30s and the early 20th century?
Well, I mean, it did, but by 1916, there's just this recognition that we want to set aside these lands for both recreational and for conservation purposes, and we want to do it in a way that negates the idea that people have been managing this land for eons, and that these newcomers can manage it in a different way that protects it from ourselves. But in fact, you can't really separate the human beings from the land. There's a symbiotic relationship there, and I've been fortunate enough to travel around the world, and I've seen cultures all around the world have that symbiotic relationship.
So just because you said the word management, it made me think of all the different agencies now, all the different, if we're even just at the federal level. National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife. I mean, I could go for a long time. And I used to work seasonally for the Forest Service and then one season for the Park Service, which is where I acquired this jacket, which I kept with me at the end of the summer, and I dug out of the closet tonight. But it makes me think back to how the culture of the Park Service felt quite different from the culture of the Forest Service, which I think corresponds to different goals. Why so many agencies managing the land? Do you have a clear sense of how the Park Service is distinct from, let's just take those other two that have a lot out here, that is the Forest Service and BLM?
I was an outsider of the National Park Service. I spent most of my life throwing rocks at the Department of Interior. So I was a big surprise to actually be asked to come on the inside and not throw rocks and try to figure out what was going on. The National Park Service has a very strong and distinct culture. And they, of course, wanted me to know that right away, and that we are different from the Bureau of Land Management, that we are different from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that we're different from the Forest Service and our friends at the Department of Agriculture. But the one thread that runs through all of those agencies is that they're supposed to be good stewards of the land. Mm-hmm. And so I had to change the concept of the staff, especially my associate directors in natural resources and sciences, and tell them, I need you to pick your heads up and I need you to work with your colleagues in Fish and Wildlife, at BLM, at the Forest Service, at the Bureau of Reclamation, because we met very early on in the Biden administration, all of those directors, Camille Tootin from Reclamation, Chief Randy Moore from the Forest Service, Tracy Stone Manning from Bureau of Land Management, Martha Williams from Fish and Wildlife, and we sat down and said, we want to do work on a landscape scale. If we are going to actually restore ecosystem function, how can we do that in the Northern Hemisphere? And how do we get help and support from our friends in Canada and Mexico? So then we came together and decided we needed to look at keystone species. And we would use those keystone species that would run the gamut between all of our, as land managers, all of our institutions and agencies. So we looked at bison, we looked at sage grouse, we looked at wild grasslands, we looked at all pollinators, and then we took this to the Forum for the Western Hemisphere and met with our counterparts in Canada and Mexico, and I was very fortunate enough to lead the delegation in the negotiations where we decided that we would set up these corridors and work on ecosystem restoration and ecosystem function, with the hope of one day of seeing bison be able to roam once again from northern Mexico into southern Canada, that we would see grasslands being put back in. And right now we're facing a collapse of pollinators, which is going to affect humans in a very negative and massive way if we can't figure out how to restore them to where they need to be. Sad to say, this current administration has nullified that agreement. And I've heard from my friends in Canada and Mexico, and they're going to continue to work on that and hope that it comes back around again. But we were ensuring that those of us who were agency heads, department heads, or bureau heads, were forcing our staff to look and start coordinating on a landscape scale rather than just as we had been doing. I'm only responsible for what's within the exterior boundaries of the park. I'm only responsible for what's the exterior boundaries of BLM land.
I mean, coordinating on a landscape scale, not just across parks and regions, but across countries, sounds incredibly complicated.
It absolutely is incredibly complicated. My counterpart, Ron Allman, who is a fantastic guy, made sure to always start in French and then would do English. Our friends in Mexico do the same thing. They'd speak and the entire speech in Spanish, and then we'd go into English. Of course, we just spoke English, but it was a great understanding that you have to learn other people's languages and understand their inflection, and they were patient with us so that we understood how they use language may be similar and how they use it differently than we do, on how we're trying to restore this. So it was a great education, a great opportunity.
What about speaking buffalo or speaking grass?
That is funny. You should say that. When we, as the United States, we put our team to work on bison, for the first time ever, they took a bison robe and a buffalo skull and brought it to every meeting so that bison was present in every meeting. And they would ask, what would bison be thinking now? And what is our relationship to be? And they wrote their first interagency, inter-bureau report on restoration with that in mind. You can find it online. It's still there. And it was exciting to watch the staff start understanding there's a reciprocal relationship with flora and fauna.
Yeah, it's very powerful to think about. And then it makes me think about some of the conflict we see around public land and public land management. That is, how do you say to a rancher, for example, you're at the table and you're speaking about how much water you need, and I am going to bring you the voice of the buffalo in response. How do you do that in a persuasive way or in a way that might move people just a little bit to recognize the validity of that voice?
When I went to law school, my least favorite subject was water law. My least favorite subject as a professional is water law because we did a horrible job with it. For those most people know, 100th meridian. So water on the East Coast is a communal source. You cannot stop the water flow that comes down a river or waterway. Your neighbor has a right to that water. Water in the West, first in use, first in right. So if I used it first, I get to control and I have that first right, and I can decide how much I wish to allocate to you or not allocate to you based on my water rights and senior water rights. And so it becomes a very complicated issue with ranchers and farmers. But that being said, they can be very good stewards of land. They know that they need cool, clean water. Mm-hmm. But what does it take to have good, cool, clean water? You have to have ecosystem function. And we've stopped that ecosystem function in so many ways, which means we have to have restoration. And so we need to work with them in ways that they understand conservation, that won't negate their work towards making money and producing livestock, but also will show them how that will flourish their livestock and make them even more healthier so that when they get them to market. So you have to be able to talk about conservation and business at the same time, and you have to look at it more than, and I went to, my undergrads is in business, and look at it more than just a monthly, quarterly, and yearly, and start talking about planning in terms of decades.
And if you succeed in getting someone to think in terms of decades, then is there suddenly harmony between business interests and conservation interests?
No, but there can get there. And we were, and I credit my counterpart at BLM because BLM land is much more mixed use. And Tracy Stone Manning's skill set of working with private land interests around and ensuring that she brought Martha Williams and myself to that table to have that discussion, and Randy Moore and Forest Service, so that we can understand what does that mean and what does it mean and how we're land managers, and explaining why we were doing the conservation on our lands and how would it affect both private lands, state and county lands too.
As I'm thinking about, we've been talking for the last few minutes, I guess, about the use of the land from one level or one perspective. And I want to go back to what you said about the 22,000 people working for the Park Service. And I want to especially think about like entry-level staff. Do you have a sense of, is it possible to generalize about who the people are that are coming in to do this public lands work, entry level? Why are they there? What's keeping them there?
Well, it's definitely not the money. It is the work itself. It's the relationships that they have with each other. I mean, National Park Service is like a small family. Even though there are 22,000 people, you get to know each other very well, and they like the military. They get transferred from different duty stations over time, many of them, especially if you want to move up in rank in the service. And they form long-term relationships and friendships that really, I think, and I've just seen this across the service, that push each other to be better at your job, to push each other to learn to be a better steward, to be a better caretaker. And it didn't matter if you worked in history interpretation, you worked in actual environmental restoration, or you did financial planning within a park. There is a sense of belonging and a sense of respect of being able to wear that arrowhead and know that you're part of something bigger than yourself, and that you do this on behalf of the American people. I hadn't experienced that since I was in the military.
So you hadn't experienced that feeling of...
To that degree of camaraderie, fellowship, and drive to want to work on behalf of the American public.
So I've seen certain, there's the famous Ken Burns miniseries about the parks, and there are many books about the parks, and there are some claims for the parks as a kind of expression of democracy. I guess we were talking before about that the parks seem to develop here. Do you feel like parks are democratic or a fundamental part of what democracy wants to be?
I think they showcase the best part of us being a democracy, that we hold these lands in common for each other, that we preserve our history and our understanding, that the National Park Service is a learning organization and does a lot of deep reflection on the stories it tells in the park and tries to figure out what stories are missing and add to them. There's been a lot of that going on, especially in the last 20 years, about what stories were missing. When I was sworn in as the 19th director, Secretary Holland told me that we must be fierce in our storytelling, and that I'm charging you on behalf of the President of the American people to go out and find stories that had not been told yet. And let's ensure that every American sees a reflection of themselves in the park. And when I talked to staff, many of the staff really understood that and also wanted to ensure that every American, whether you were just sworn in yesterday as a new citizen of the United States, or you came here on the Mayflower, or you'd been here for 30,000 years, that every American should see a reflection of themselves in the park and find a story that connects to them and who they are. And it's hugely democratic. I got that sense as a young sailor in 1989. We were in between courses at the intelligence school. A buddy of mine was getting married, so we took him and got him married in Bath, Maine. The four of us had 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks left before we had to be back to base for school. So we decided to take a road trip from Maine to Florida with the idea that we'd stop at every national park, monument, and memorial along the way. Sounds romantic, and mostly because they were free, and we just slept in a van. But it was, as a young 18-year-old, I guess I just turned 19, with guys from Chicago, a guy from Newark, New Jersey, and a guy from San Francisco. We got to walk in the footsteps of our fellow human beings and our fellow Americans. So in Maine, we walked in the foots of the native people who've lived in Maine for the last 15,000 years plus. We got to walk in the settings of colonial Massachusetts. We walked in the same steps of revolutionary soldiers. We stood on the precipice of the battlefields of the Civil War, de-embarkation, industrialization. I remember when we were in New Jersey, in Paterson, New Jersey, at Great Falls, and looking at that and the whole structure and Hamilton's ideas that we were going to become an industrialized nation. I mean, the four of us still once in a while chat with each other. It was very formative. But what it did, it set a groundwork for the oath that we took to defend the Constitution of the United States against any enemies, foreign or domestic, really to heart, because we saw what this idea of our Constitution was and our idea of a democracy, and that it really is just an idea. And that we needed to preserve and protect that idea. And I watch and I look at the staff as I traveled around the country. I got to over 120 national parks inside of just over 3 years, and talking to staff, and then they also take that same oath, and they believe in that oath, that they are there as good stewards to protect the Constitution of the United States, and that they must be able to be true to America's story by telling the diversity of who we are as Americans.
You've talked a few times about heavy overlap between your sense of the military and national parks. And even the uniform bears some resemblance. I just want to ask what you think about that, about ways that the two are engaged in a similar project and where they might depart.
So not everybody wears a uniform in the National Park Service. People think everybody does. They actually don't. You actually have to get a letter that says that you're authorized to wear a uniform. And the uniform, of course, is based on the Army, because in the early days, the national parks were protected by predominantly cavalry all across, whether it was Yellowstone or Yosemite. And so after the Organic Act was passed in 1916, many officers took their retirement and became the first superintendents, and then were able to convince some of their soldiers to leave them, if they were leaving the service, to come work for them. And they didn't have a uniform at the time, so they just wore their old uniforms and adapted them to the Park Service. And we've just kept that with the campaign hat, the green jacket, the pants. I personally don't like mixing brown with gray, but that's just me. But we have a brown belt with a gray shirt and brown and shoes with a tan hat. But that uniform, though, is actually really egalitarian, and it's one of the things I really like about the National Park Service. It doesn't matter if you're a first-year seasonal or you're the director, you wear the exact same uniform. And so I used to love going to the mall in uniform, and would be talking to staff and having visitors come by, and of course they look at the 5 rangers all standing in uniform, and since I'm the one talking, you must be the senior ranger. Hey, could you tell me where the bathroom is? And you have to have the ranger point down to tell them that's where the bathroom's at. Here's where the train station, metro station you're looking for. Here's how you get to the Lincoln Memorial.
You do that well. You did, yeah.
Yeah, the staff used to love it, and they say, I think that's the best part about being part of this service, is our uniform is exactly the same. It's very egalitarian.
Well, that feels quite different from the military.
Well, we all wear the same uniform, except we wear collar insignia that tell the difference of rank.
Right. I guess that's part of what I've been thinking about as you've been talking about the core democratic institutions, one about our defense, one about our relationship to the land. And so I want to ask again about where you see possibly departures between the two or distance between the two.
I don't know if there's... I will say that everybody knows your rank regardless if you wear one or not in the National Park Service.
That's democratic too.
That's democratic too. And so, people know who's senior, just because, again, it's a small family, and a lot of people stay with the service for years and decades, so they know who's senior and who's not senior.
But you see, it sounds like at the core, a lot of real deep overlap or similarity between these
There's
two.
just this dedication to mission, and it's very mission-driven. They will block everything else out to meet that mission. And so when you look at the history of parks and the fluctuation of funding, parks have gone up and down as an agent funding. The one thing that all Park Service staff do very well is that they will continue to meet that mission. And so if you tell them to do more with less, they will do more with less. Mm-hmm. If you tell them to do more with more, because they got more, they'll do even more with more. And I kept telling them that, the only issue with that is that they burn themselves out. And we were working very hard very early on about work-life balance and psychological safety. We had the very first psychological safety stand down. We brought in more resources because some folks were working themselves a little too hard. And as I was leaving the service, because our budgets were coming down, I was reminding them, I need you to do less with less. I need you to be more strategic in what you do in your park based on what are those foundations. Because I could walk into a park and within a half hour, I could tell whether the superintendent came from cultural resources, natural resources, maintenance, logistics, because that park shined in that particular area. But that park might not be a natural resource park, it might be a historical park. And I need you to concentrate on interpretation and history and less on that beautiful lawn that you keep wanting to cut.
So when you step back a little bit, now that you're not in that position anymore, what about things that you think we're getting wrong with this big agency?
What are we getting wrong with it? Mostly that it's underfunded. And what had been wrong for many years is that they were ignoring tribes, and we talked about that, that they were not talking to the original stewards. There was a lot of discussion, of course, with gateway communities, which is rightfully so, with the states and the state partnerships and the county partnerships that surround the parks in those states, but there was very little discussion with tribes. And a lot of it was a misunderstanding. I had to remind the staff that when they took their oath of office, which is that same one, to uphold the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that means that they also have an obligation to uphold and protect over 370 treaties with tribes, and that there are 574 tribes that expect you to uphold those treaties, and that when you don't do that, you fail to meet your oath. I had 30 and 40-year veterans say, no one has ever told us that. It was the first time I've ever heard that. And I said, that's sad, because then you are so dedicated to the mission, you are so dedicated to the Organic Act, you're so dedicated to your oath, you've actually not been fulfilling that. So when I came into the National Park Service, we had, I think, 10 co-stewardship, co-management agreements. When I left, we had 159 with 50 more almost done. The Biden administration pushed through that they wanted more co-stewardship agreements, so we had 400 total as a government, of which nearly 200 were the National Park Services alone, working with over 300 different tribes.
Sounds like the idea of stewardship is in you, deep, deeper than it may be for many of us. And I guess I wonder, like, how do we do that? How do we get, especially young people, to internalize ideas of stewardship, both ecological and cultural?
You know, for me, I grew up here with a plethora of teachers like Bobby Connor, like Antone Minthorn, like Frenchie Half Moon, Jay Minthorn, many who have passed on now, my grandfather, his brothers, who taught me about Tumunwit, our law, how we were stood up as human beings. And in our belief system, I know that my eyesight was a gift from eagle, that my skin was a gift from elk as part of its hide, that my hearing comes from the owl, that my entire nervous system and veins come from the plants who donated, because they donated all these things to create me as a human being. And the major gift that we got from salmon was two things. One, we got of its voice completely. It wanted us to have a common language, which is where you get Chinook jargon on the Columbia River as the common language. And plus, you know that because if you ever squeezed a salmon, it doesn't make any sounds. It's because it gave up of its voice completely. And second, it gave up of its body to us so that we would have something to nourish ourselves. But in doing so, it told and asked that a covenant be made with the Creator who created us as human beings, and said, with all these gifts, this thing that you're called human being must be our steward. It must protect and preserve and enhance us so that we come year after year. And it's a covenant that my people have kept since we were created as human beings. As I've traveled around country, while I don't believe that there's pan-Indianism overall because each culture is different, that one ideal of stewardship and how they may have been created as human beings or what they've been charged with does seem to be a commonality as I've traveled around the country with tribes. How do we do that with the rest of the American people and teach them as stewards? The Organic Act of 1916 tells us to do that. It tells us that we need to preserve, protect, and enhance these lands for both its recreational and its natural and cultural resource values. And the National Park Service is well set to teach that stewardship mindset, because these lands that we've held aside are what's helping us understand better the effects of change in our natural resources. Most recently, as we're combating climate change, we've been able to use national parks because they collect data. We have some of the finest scientists, finest recorders of information, who have over 100 years of history now that can tell us what flora and fauna have done, what it looks like, and how we can start not only mitigating for it, but how do we adapt for it. Adaptation was a harder issue for the National Park Service to do, because we had to go in, I had to go and explain, if you go to Redwoods National Forest in California and you dig 60 feet down, there's a different forest there 10,000 years ago. So who planted this redwood forest? But then if you dig 200 feet below that, there's a completely different forest there before then. That was there 15 to 20,000 years ago. Well, who planted that forest? It tells me that there were different climate change events, and we know that there were different climate change events, and the humans who were living on this landscape put in the forest that they needed to adapt for whatever their needs were at the time. And so we in the National Park Service, as we were working on climate change, I had to say, we're gonna have to do different than just mitigation, we're gonna have to do adaptation. When I first came in, the forests at Acadia that we were replanting, we were seeing survival rates of only 10 to 15% of the trees, because those are the trees in there. And when I spoke to the natural resource manager, said, well, my job is to protect these lands of perpetuity as they were in the state we found them. I'm like, yes, but I need you to look about what trees were there 10,000 years ago, and what did that survival rate look like. And we started planting trees that actually were more from the Massachusetts area and seeing a 70 to 90% survival rate. And so we're starting to plan and looking at how across the board were we going to have to change the landscape to fit the humans' needs and the flora and fauna, the other animals' needs, because we aren't good at reversing what's happening yet.
So I've been asking you a lot of questions about, from the perspective of someone who is on the Park Service side. And I'm thinking again about that very authoritative point you showed before. Like, there's the bathroom, there's the interpretive center. And I'm thinking also about the loftiness of the goals, and to internalize this deep ethical approach, stewardship. How explicit, or how much should I, just a random park visitor, know that I'm not just there for a good view, but I'm there to develop maybe a stronger ethical relationship to the world I find myself in? Is it important that I recognize that that's some of what's going on?
We tell everybody when I was in the Park Service, plan like a ranger. And fortunately, we have modern ways of doing that. And the current app, and it's going to go through some changes, allows you to plan your trip. But we ask people, your first stop should be a visitor center. You should take the time to actually read the displays, because it's asking you those questions and what your role is in the park, and that everybody plays an important role. Even if it's as basic as, leave no trace. Pack in what you brought in and pack it out. There are ways to learn. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people just come into the park and they will head to their favorite trail. And so that's why we were putting more rangers in the park. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, we knew that the National Park Service was down by 20% of staff from 2010. Yet we'd seen a 20% increase in visitors. And so I cut a deal with members of Congress for $500 million for 1,700 more staff. Really needed about 3,500, but I knew I wasn't going to get that. So I was able to do it. But I made the deal that these staff would not come to headquarters. They could not be hired by headquarters, and they could not be hired into regional offices. These staff would only go out in the field. And we hired over 900 of the 1,700 by the time I left this last January. Sadly, those were the 900 that were let go. They're now just slowly coming back because they were in their probationary period. Yeah. But those folks were people that did the real work in the parks. They were not the excess people that you would find at a regional headquarters or at the headquarters in Washington, D.C.
So I have just two more questions before we open to questions from this microphone. And the first is pointed to by what you were just saying about the loss of probationary staff, and that is that in this moment we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I assume the National Park Service is planning all sorts of things that will be part of, I think, a very complicated marking of an anniversary. And it's especially complicated probably out here. Oregon wasn't a state 250 years ago. There were people living here much longer than 250 years. How do you think about an anniversary like that and public lands, and maybe especially the park?
I don't know what this administration is going to do. We had laid down the foundation and we had spoken to the staff, and this really came from the staff, of how they wanted to celebrate America at 250. Mm-hmm. And what they really wanted to do, and I thought this was brilliant when I came on board and listening to staff from all over the Park Service to come in who did the briefings and different sections of it. They started with the Declaration of Independence, and they said, who's in it and who's not? Mm. And they wanted to concentrate on African Americans and slavery and what that meant, because it isn't specifically called out in the Declaration of Independence, but they recognize that's what helped build America and its agriculture on the East Coast. They wanted to talk about, as Abigail Adams said, women, and she'd asked John Adams, don't leave the women out, but he did. They wanted to talk about the savage Indians and what did that mean and the role they played and how did they become U.S. citizens. And then from that, they wanted to talk about each and every struggle and our rights to pursuing happiness and what does it mean to be equitable and just. And that we as Americans have had to fight for equality and justice all along the way. And so they wanted to do that arc, starting with a celebration of those three through the year, and end it with a celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the continued fight for the LGBTQ community that we're doing today to see what those civil rights will end up being. Because they said this idea that was planted in the Declaration has made us stronger by that diversity and that fight. Were there horrific portions of that? Absolutely. But we as a nation came out better from it, from learning from it, and that people who stood up to ensure that their equality wasn't being stepped on and that justice would prevail ultimately. I don't know what this administration is going to do.
Yeah. Last question I want to ask is, before opening the floor to questions, is, again, now that you've stepped out of this role and still in the natural resource world, is there for you a question that you, if I give you a second, is there a question in your head about natural resource work or public lands work that feels like it's genuinely open for you? A question you kind of keep wondering about?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always the same question. It's the human thing of, when is enough? Is it going to be enough for us to cut down the last tree? Is it going to be enough for us to poison our water system before we learn a lesson? Or can we learn of our own mistakes in the past as human beings and learn from it and become better at stewarding those resources? Because we don't just steward them for ourselves in this moment, we steward it for the children yet born. And we need to think 7, 10, 12 generations down the road to ensure that these resources are here for them that make us who we are as people.
Let's do this. Can we say a preliminary thank you to Chuck?
Thank you. Very kind of you.
We have a microphone here, and we'll encourage questions that you have for Chuck. And then also, I think if from Willamette, if anybody wants to send in questions from Salem. And let's see, if you can make your way, or if you have a question and you don't want to make your way to the microphone, then your question needs to be short enough and clear enough that I can restate it into the microphone for people here. So is there anybody that's got one right off the bat? Great, and you want to ask it from there, so I'm going to ask that you maybe tell us your name and then make the question short enough to synthesize. Frank, thank you.
I've gotten lost in a lot of the verbiage, but you were talking about people within Park Service do they take into account oral history to understand what's there in the parks?
So I think Frank's question was, do the people working in the parks take into account oral history to understand what's there?
Absolutely. And it's been amazing, the work of the historical staff and the academic rigor that they go through when they are not only just looking at primary sources, that they will go in the field and they will ask for oral histories, even throughout the Park Service. They've always made sure to record and bring in oral histories. Most recently, we were looking at what they wanted to call an emancipation trail from Galveston to Houston. And there is no documents that there was an actual trail of folks from when slavery was ruled out in the United States that were making their way there. When we went and talked to the African American community, because we thought there must be some oral history there, they did interviews through the communities from Galveston to Houston, only to say from the community itself, the African Americans said, well, Galveston was an economic hub. Of course we came up here. It wasn't a trail. We just all came here. Matter of fact, we came on that trail because the tribes had been using that same trail for thousands of years. So the oral history actually went back to recognizing the tribes, and many folks in the Houston area wanted it to be named after the tribes rather than be called an emancipation trail. So we do take into account oral histories, and they can end up changing the perspective and the ideals of what we're trying to preserve or protect then.
People got to be sitting on questions here. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Peter Donovan, and I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sams, that you mentioned co-management agreements between parks and tribes. Do you think the BLM, for example, has the inclination or the capacity to do that same sort of thing with local conservation organizations as well as tribes? What do you see as the future with that? And that's a question related to your question, Adam, about people and land.
Do you want to try to restate that, or should I?
Go ahead, you want to try?
Peter's asking about co-management between parks and the tribes, and especially, he brought it down one more level that I lost while asking Chuck.
Conservation organizations.
Conservation organization. Thank you.
There are legal definitions. This is where my law degree comes in, and I don't necessarily agree with the legal definitions, but they are what they are based on what the solicitors have decided. Co-management is only can be done with another sovereign, because you're giving up a specific federal responsibility to someone else. So you can't necessarily give it to a community group or a public or private, well, you give it to a public if it's part of a government, but not a public-private institution. If you're doing that, then that's co-stewardship. And you can come into co-stewardship agreements and allow them to steward cooperatively with the federal agency, like BLM, on that. And they've done a number of those projects with conservation organizations to do co-stewardship. But co-management must be done with another sovereign. So it could be done with the state, in which they've already been doing that for years, many federal agencies. But it was a relatively new idea that they would actually do it with tribes. And being able to push through that tribes had reserved rights and therefore can co-manage that. And we just pointed out a plethora of court cases where that already existed, so that folks understood what that meant. And what they also found out is that many times tribes, like other governments, brought additional resources and their own money to the table.
Please.
Washington public lands have all been opened up to logging. And I don't know where Oregon too. What does that mean? How can the executive branch alone do that? What's coming down the pipe for us there?
So Brenda, thanks for your question about public lands being open up to logging. Definitely in Washington and perhaps here. What does that mean?
It really depends. So the law, so each federal agency has different responsibilities as they were set up. Bureau of Land Management has mixed use. It has both public-private use of the lands and mixed uses of those lands, including being able to extract minerals and extract logs, same as the Forest Service does. National Park Service doesn't necessarily have that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because in the legislation that set up that park, it may have allowed for an extraction. And if it's in there and it's an allowable activity, then somebody can petition and try to get a lease in order to do that act. In general, that's only a handful of parks for the National Park Service. Congress has been usually pretty good about preserving, under the Organic Act, those resources not being exploited. But it can happen. But it really just depends on the federal agency that has responsibility for that land management.
I don't know if any of the EOU folks who are here. Yeah, great. Please.
Well, hi, I'm Anna Quat, Native Amrex Telecom, EOU, Musaiga, Haidamasi, Walla. Hi, my name's Anna Quat. I'm a student at EOU. There's lots of us here. You mentioned jargon, which I really appreciate. So, in my best Chinook jargon, on behalf of all of us, thank you for speaking tonight. It's really lovely.
Very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to say that, will you say your name one more time? Anapa? Express gratitude, which I think is shared in the room. So thank you. Other questions or comments that people want to add? Jennifer, you have one from somewhere else, from Salem. And Jennifer's also at Oregon Humanities, as is Vicki out front. So thanks for helping make this go.
So first, Shirley Knapp from Salem says hi and good going. And then Gary wants to know about the number of beavers in our parks and if they're increasing.
Thanks. Well, first of all, Shirley Knapp, her late husband was Don Knapp, who was a middle school and junior high teacher. She is my best friend's mother. So, hi, Shirley. Yes, I mean, we had been working, there are a number of projects working on beavers to ensure that, nature's engineer is back in the parks and really helping in ways that support ecosystem function. And so, particularly in the West, we'd been looking at how beavers had been integrated into the Park Service and the landscape in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I remember, though, when I was a watershed director in Portland, I was the Columbia Sloughs watershed director, and after the floods of 95, 96, the beaver population grew very hugely along the Columbia Slough, was causing backups, and we had to figure out how we could transport beavers out into other parts of Oregon, which, as the beaver state was not very popular with some of the liberal folks in Portland, and so I ended up designing a program called the Better Beaver Behavior Program. And we did a picture of a person trying to teach etiquette to two beavers who were having tea. That program worked as we were extracting beavers to put them in other parts of the state, in other watersheds where they were needed.
That's a regional program that if you transplanted that program out east, they would not know what's going on.
No, just right. It's very, very, very regional.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go.
Hi, my name's Vicki. I live in the Grand. At the very beginning, you talked about being government property, and since then we've talked about public land. I wonder how you think about property and land, and when those are the same or when they're different.
So Vicki just asked about property and land and when they're the same and when they're different.
I know from a human perspective, we like to think that we have dominance over land. Years ago, I worked, when I was working in New York City, I got to work in the 90s on a history project, and they invited members of the clergy in, and was having a dinner with an imam, a rabbi, a Presbyterian minister, and a Catholic priest, and myself, and we were just talking about it, and about this idea, especially under Genesis. And what made me think that I'd never thought about before is that both the imam and the rabbi said, in Genesis it wasn't dominion. That was a Latin word that came up with for the Christians. It was actually stewardship. In Old Hebrew, in Aramaic, the word was stewardship. Imagine how the Judeo-Christian life cycle of working on the landscape would be if we didn't look at dominance and owning property, but that we were stewarding it for ourselves and for everybody around us. So that's how I think about it. How did I become ownership? So for a long time, natives were considered chattel. We were considered government property. I still remember when I left for the service in 1988, I stopped by Phil Sanchez's office, who was the superintendent for the tribe. He congratulated me on joining the Navy and handed me an envelope, and he said, when you get to the barracks for receiving and outfitting, hand this over to the officer in charge. I was like, sure. So I took it and had it, and I got on the plane, and as I was heading down to San Diego, I opened it up and I read it, and I was being transferred from the Department of Interior with my enrollment number attached, my tribal enrollment number, to the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy. And now I was the Navy's responsibility until such time as my contract ended, and then I would become back under the Department of Interior and Bureau of Indian Affairs. That doesn't happen anymore, but that was just in 1988.
Did you rip it up?
No, I handed it to the receiving officer. I still follow orders. As my father said, if you ever want to become a leader, first you have to be a good follower.
That's right.
I think, yeah, please, Christina.
I'm Christina. I live in Lostine. I have the baby. Sorry about the squawks. What did the bison skulls say? And are other skulls sitting in other rooms in the Park Service now speaking? Or are there people who are carrying on that piece of the mission?
So Christina from Lostine is asking what the bison skull said and other skulls that might not yet have been at the table and what they're saying.
You know, as some people would consider that hippie-ish, the staff actually felt, again, understanding there's a reciprocal relationship with the land, the water, the flora, and the fauna. And I remember going to a butterfly sanctuary with Martha Williams and us just listening to the butterflies and the air that they were pushing, and what are they trying to tell us? What are they trying to achieve? We were watching staff, especially science staff, who are very well trained in Western science, starting to understand that and wanting to get back on the landscape, because many of them, that's what they wanted to do in the first place. They wanted to be out on the landscape. They wanted to be with it, but you kind of get stuck in an idea of, well, I've got to do restoration, I've got to do these large projects, I've got to move earth and dirt, I've got to replant trees. We started asking staff just to go back out in the field. Do what you were doing when you originally started in the field. What did you like about your field work, and what is the land telling you? The land will tell you how to heal itself if you just stop and listen. The flora and fauna will tell you how to heal itself if you just stop and listen. And staff were starting to do more of that. And we saw in not just national parks, but in the other bureaus themselves too.
Please.
Catherine Brown from Pendleton. I am wondering if it is at all likely or possible that there will be new national parks created in the United States.
So Catherine Brown from Pendleton is asking if it's possible that there will be new national parks created in this country.
Peter Walters says Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago used to be a national park site.
No.
It was sold. Surprise. Mar-a-Lago used to be a national park site, and it got sold off as excess federal property.
Wow.
So, will new parks be made? So, parks, I love this because people always say, when are you going to create a new park? The National Park Service does not create parks. Congress creates parks, or the President of the United States can do a monument, national monument memorial through the Antiquities Act. Now, I do get to advise on the Antiquities Act, and I had a team that we did 5 different Antiquities Act projects while I was director. Those were probably the highlight of my career, being able to work with the dynamic team that got to put those memorials together. Emmett Till and Mamie Mobley Till Mobley was very moving. It was the first national monument we did in 2 states. In Chicago, at the church where she was brave enough to have an open casket for Emmett, and then in Mississippi at the site in which he was murdered. But will this administration, will the Congress make a new national park? I don't know. There's legislation that's sitting in Congress now, I think, for 3 different new sites. They haven't moved out of committee. And so, there's the potential. And it just depends if they get enough advocates to get them moved out of committee and to voting on the floor. As you know, this president wants to revamp the Antiquities Act, but that will still be up to Congress to decide. But a president could choose just not to use the Antiquities Act if they want, and that's purely within their prerogative.
I think as we go to a question back here, I think that question's related to the question about like what was happening in 1872 that made it a moment, that opened this up. What was happening in the 1920s and 30s, and then again in the 60s, let's say, that led to these kinds of openings for more of this sort of thing? Thanks for asking that in that focused way. Please.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm from EOU. That kind of relates to my question. Last year we went on a trip to Utah, and we went to Bears Ears National Monument. And while we were there, they said that they didn't want to become a national park because that would mean flock more people. And so I was wondering what your opinion on that is.
Great. So Alan from EOU, based on a trip to Bears Ears, where people did not want to become a national park because too many people, wants to know what Chuck thinks of that.
I'm glad we listen to the people. It's important that you listen to the people that live in these areas about what they want as national parks, what they want as national monuments and memorials. We in the National Park Service doesn't control every national memorial. Forest Service has national memorials, BLM, Fish and Wildlife even, to a lesser extent. And so that's just a different tools that can be used to preserve those places in cooperation with the community and congressional delegations. In that particular one, the Antiquities Act was used, and the decision was, the smallest footprint to be able to preserve that and then do it jointly with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. National Park Service helps with interpretation, though, because that isn't necessarily their strength. And so we were sending over interpreters to help them work with the tribes and the Bears Ear Coalition to determine how best to interpret that. And then we are still helping them because it is partially public land of what it would look like for visitation and how do you control access to protected areas.
So in just a moment, so we'll go last question here, then I'm going to say a last little business thing and then invite Bobby up to close us out. So please, your question, please.
Yeah, I would love to hear about your role now moving forward, getting back to Oregon, and what your work will look like.
And can you just let us know what your name is?
My name is Carrie, and I live in LeGrand.
Carrie in LeGrand, wondering what Chuck's up to.
I'm very indebted to Governor Kotek. So I was, before I joined the National Park Service, I'd gotten we got a call shortly after the election, right? Shortly after the election, transition team, and I thought it was a joke that somebody was calling me if I wanted to be the 19th Director of the National Park Service, and found out that no, it was a real question. Then the president, as they were preparing for Biden to be sworn in as president, Ruby and I were playing soccer. It was a nice winter day in the front yard, and the phone rang, and I said, ignore it. And the person called back again, so Ruby ran over, and she picked it up, and she says, hey, Dad, it says Gov. Oh, well, I probably should answer that one. So I called Governor Brown back, who was governor, and she said, chit-chatted for a while, and then she says, do you have any interest in being on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council as Oregon's representative? And I laughed. And she says, are you laughing at me? I said, I'm not laughing at you. I've been waiting for this call for 26 years. John Brigiotti had been on the council when I was working doing salmon and watershed restoration, and I was enamored by the work of how they balanced power needs with mitigating for fish and wildlife. I was doing fish and wildlife work, and John and I were walking one day at Ice Harbor Dam, and I said, hey, how do you get a job like this? And he goes, oh, it's easy. You just got to befriend a governor. I was 25 years old. I didn't know a governor. But there was a young legislator who got assigned to the Commission on Indian Affairs, and the late Jay Minthorn asked if I would help introduce her to the tribes. She became a senator. She became Secretary of State. She became governor. And then Kate said to me, we've known each other for that long. How come you've never asked me? And I said, well, because you're my friend. I didn't want to ask a friend for a job. And she says, that's how it works. So I said, the only problem is I just got a call from the White House asking if I have any interest in being the 19th director of the National Park Service. And she says, oh, you want that job. You come do this job for me and we'll wait till such time, because if for some reason you don't get confirmed, you'll have your job. And as we were finishing up and we saw that we might be losing, well, we knew when we lost the election, I called Governor Brown, former Governor Brown, and said, what are the chances of me getting that job back? She goes, oh, 0. I said, really? Yes. But you know, weirder things have happened. And surprisingly, weirder things do happen. And I got a call from the governor's natural resource advisor asking if I would like to return to the council. And I said, yes, because now I'm back to the job that I've been waiting for over 26 years. And so I sit as Oregon's representative on the council. Margie Hoffman, who I've known for 20 years, she is brilliant on energy and energy development and siting. And I have background in that, but she is far superior than I am in that. She also sits on the council, her and I together, and I oversee the fish and wildlife portfolio, and we distribute programs and projects of over $250 million of BPA funding to states and governments and local entities to do salmon and watershed restoration as we try to balance out the Pacific Northwest power needs from BPA and selling that power to the utility companies. So I'll continue that work for now. UVO Law will announce shortly that I will join them as a scholar in residence in this fall, and I'll be working on some law papers, so I'll get a chance to do some writing again and thinking around working with I'll be a senior fellow working with some junior fellows on further exploring co-management and co-stewardship with tribes and the legal precedents that have already been set, and to reinforce those legal precedents, because of course you have to write law papers about that so people can cite you. So I'm going to have to cite myself from what I already wrote so that I can put it in a law paper so that somebody else can peer review it and then critique it so that it actually becomes much more part of the legal landscape in the United States.
So, okay, I said we have one. Let's do, if they're super short, last 2 questions.
Mine's gonna be really short. One, thank you to both of you. You're an amazing moderator and you did a great job. 2, thank you for turning the lights on in Washington DC at the Roosevelt Memorial and the Korean Memorial for Harriet and me. And the last thing is, what would you charge all of us here with to be our responsibility?
And can you just say what your name is?
Susan DeMar.
Susan, thank you. Pendleton, I'm going to skip the first one except the thanks. Thank you for turning on the lights in a couple places in D.C. And what would you charge us all to do?
What is your charge to us?
First of all, as Lori knows, the ambassador made it very clear to me that the lighting structures at the National Mall were subpar. It was actually one of the very first orders that I worked on under the Great American Outdoors Act for us to put better lighting in these facilities, and we did an improvement on the bathrooms. So you can thank the ambassador for all of that happened on the National Mall the next time you visit.
Yeah.
You know, the charge that I tell anyone is that a democracy is only as strong as the people that participate in it. And I don't care if you are not old enough to vote or you're one of our elders, we need you to participate in that democracy. And you do so by speaking up. Your First Amendment right to be vocal, to also ask redress from your government is a fundamental right that the Founding Fathers understood was what is needed if you're going to have a thriving republic with democratic values. And so I ask each and every American to make sure that your voice is heard, and you can do that in a number of ways.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to go last question, and then point of business, and then handing it to Bobby to close us out.
Randy Knopp, Union County. What do you see as the 2 greatest threats facing our parks in the coming decade?
Randy from Union County asking about the 2 greatest threats facing our national parks in the coming decade. A softball of a last question.
Well, you know, first one is inadequate funding. National Park Service has gone fits and start with funding. And so when parks are created, Congress actually does not authorize no more than $175,000 for that park, which is just enough money to put a desk in that park and somebody with a flat hat.
Wow.
And then that first superintendent has to build the infrastructure. It's amazing. I've seen them do it. And you get somebody's really good at that, and you let them run with it. So that is its biggest threat. You know, the two largest funding times for the national parks was during Mission 66, 1955, or 1956 to 1966. At the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service, money was put in, new roads were built, visitor center, and then they provided no money for maintenance. And they still didn't provide money for maintenance. So when I took over the National Park Service as its director, I was told, as I was coming in, you have $11.7 billion in deferred maintenance. But the Great American Outdoors Act passed, and you're going to get about $7 billion to deal with it. You won't get all, but you'll get $7 billion to deal with it over a 5-year period. Then on the second day, I get a call from my staff who said, so we weren't calculating deferred maintenance like the industry standard. It's actually $23.3 billion. And the secretary wants to talk to you. So I go to see the secretary, and she goes, and now you need to go up and normalize that with Congress and ask them for more money. And so, you know, until that deferred maintenance is taken care of and that parks are adequately funded so that they can take care of their maintenance, we are going to sadly love our parks to death. I think that is going to be the next threat over the next decade if we don't fund them adequately. The second biggest threat is climate change. And if this administration or any other administration wants to deny that it's here, all you need to go to is in a national park. They are on the forefront. Because they've done such a good job of trying to preserve the park in situ as it was when it was formed, you can see what climate change has done in deteriorating the flora and fauna and cultural resources. And they've been able to try to, as long as they can, to preserve it as best they can, but it's becoming much more expensive, and we need to mitigate and have a better plan for how doing that. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, we had invested in the national parks $235 million into climate change adaptation and resiliency work. And a lot of that money is just slowly being clawed back now.
Thank you for the excellent questions from everyone here. Thanks for driving from many places around the state. Thanks for piping in from around the state and further away. Before handing it to Bobby, I guess I want to just mention that Oregon Humanities has a couple other programs coming up soon. Next week, we're going to be talking with Nicole Hannah-Jones at Oregon State University in Corvallis. Now, that one is not streamed, so I apologize for that. Usually they are. In early May in Portland, we're talking with Danielle Allen, and I don't know if people know Danielle Allen, but she embodies democracy and much of what Chuck has been talking about more than just about anybody around. She understands and has ideas about how to strengthen our democracy. And if you're able to join in person or online, I think it'll be worth it. The National Endowment for the Humanities, which supports Oregon Humanities, the National Park Service, which Chuck has been talking about, I just want to say they do need our voices, and they need more than that. And I hope that you continue to show up in all sorts of ways, the way you're showing up tonight. I think our institutions and organizations need it, and it helps both the nature and the culture and how they go together. And that's much what we've been talking about. I want to pass it over to Bobby Connor to close us out for tonight. Bobby, thanks for being game. Is it okay if I let you take this seat?
Oh, I know. We're laughing. We haven't seen each other since I got home.
So just to continue on the stream of thought about your First Amendment rights, Adam didn't say they got a notice last week that under our new government efficiency mandates, their grant has been terminated from the National Endowment, including Oregon Humanities funding through 2027. And that's about 44% of Adam's budget. So, and while I was sitting here tonight, Tmusik got a grant notification that our grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services was terminated for a 2-year project that included exhibit upgrades and an employee who's working in conservation and lithics. So please, Susan, dear neighbor, all of you, please do speak up. I would love to have a Congress that was doing our jobs, representing our communities and our lands and our needs and all the care that needs to be given our country. And I think they need our help getting a backbone. So some of you may know that Chuck, in October, while he was director of the National Park Service, was honored by the Oregon Historical Society as a history maker. There are selected each year and honored at an event in Portland at the Art Museum, and Chuck received the History Maker Award in October. And two of our neighbors, John Bishop and Mort Bishop of the Pendleton Woolen Mills Bishop family, wanted to give Chuck a present, but they knew as a federal official there's a limit on what he gets to keep. So if they gave him a present then, it'd be a present to the National Park Service. Just noting that the Pendleton Woolen Mills National Parks blankets, socks, hats, cups, all support National Parks Foundation. So it's one of the funding mechanisms to support the parks is buying those National Parks products. So John and Mort Bishop gave Chuck this in October, and I've been sitting on it. So it's camoed in a Roundup bag, but it says Charles F. Sams, director. And it's the Crater Lake blanket.
Yeah.
I'll just add that the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla is not only glad to have Chuck back in the neighborhood, but we're still enormously proud of him, and we expect more history to be made by the work that Chuck does. Thank you.
Chuck, any last, you close us
No,
up?
my vanity is still there. So as my wife will point out, if you look at my license plate now, they're of Crater Lake, but it says NPS D19. I want to say thank you, Adam. I've known Adam for a long time. When I was on the Oregon's Cultural Trust Board, he was a wonderful partner. And, Oregon Humanities has the tough discussions, but the discussions that we need to have in a thriving democracy. And any support that you can, and being tonight here is a great support, but any additional support in lending your voice in part of this democracy to ensure that funding comes back, I know would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for your friendship, Adam.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. We're all good. Thank you.